Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Teddy Roosevelt, the Trustbuster, Episode 4, Trainwreck by Extra History. Last time we saw as Teddy Roosevelt succeeded in breaking up Standard Oil, sort of the big bad guy of this series from the beginning. But Teddy's work isn't done yet. There are still a lot of trusts participating in these unfair business practices, and he has a long way to go. But before we get into that, I would very much appreciate it if you guys would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this video.
The House of Representatives, February 28, 1906. Theodore Roosevelt's new pet legislation, the Hepburn Bill, has just passed the House. The act prevents the
We talked about how last time the judicial action was great, taking Rockefeller and Standard Oil to court. In some ways very effective, but not necessarily enough. You need more than just the judicial branch. Of course, Teddy's been working at this the whole time, but you need to get some legislation passed. That means you gotta work with Congress. That can be very tricky.
kind of behavior Standard Oil and the railroads engaged in to create monopolies and control prices.
Yeah.
Justice Department lawyers are still fighting for Standard's breakups in the courts, but Roosevelt has realized that's not a productive avenue. They'll never catch everyone. To break the power of the trusts, Roosevelt can't rely on prosecuting illegal behavior after it's occurred. He has to prevent it with legislation. But the progressive-leaning House of Representatives isn't the real fight. That'll happen in the more conservative Senate, where Roosevelt will have to broker deals and make alliances to get the bill through.
Of course, a similar picture we see today. The House of Representatives is more based on the popular electorate. Elections are more frequent, shorter terms, versus the Senate, which is the opposite of those things. And so the House of Representatives tends to be more, representative of the mood of the general public at that moment. So you have a situation like this where Theodore has a lot of public support for his progressive policies, and so the House is swinging in that direction, but the Senate, he's going to have a hard time with the Senate.
Including with the congressman he hates most.
Oh my. Can't wait to find out who this is. Mentioned it twice now.
Thanks so much to Audible for helping make our extra history research fun. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt gave a public speech discussing the role of journalism in the progressive movement. Illustrating the good and ill of crusading journalism, he compared them to a character from the philosophical novel Pilgrim's Progress, who used a rake to clear away muck.
The men with the muck rakes are often indispensable to the well-being of society,
Roosevelt said.
but only if they know when to stop raking the muck.
This speech showed Roosevelt's sometimes rocky relationship with the progressive press, who always pushed him to go further, but who he was also happy to cultivate and promote if it served his purposes.
Yes, like a lot of presidents, he has an up and down relationship with the media. The media can be a very powerful tool for presidents who know how to manipulate it if the media is cooperating. It can also really damage your reputation, your image, your campaign. So presidents often have a rocky relationship with the media. We've talked about how Teddy, he knew how to get the word out, and the media was a good partner in doing that, but, wasn't always hunky-dory, right? And so from this speech, we see the emergence of the term muckraker, and that's what a lot of these sort of progressive era investigative journalists are referred to as, muckrakers. We're talking late 1800s into, 1900s, 1910s, 20s, it sort of peters out after that. We don't really have muckrakers today. You might just call them investigative journalists. That's probably what we would refer to, a muckraker as today. And so it's interesting. It's sort of up and down relationship, but they do a lot of good work. And in the era before this, in sort of the late 1800s, which is leading into the era we're talking about, we have a lot of what is called yellow journalism, which is basically journalism based on sensationalism, right? That's the point. To sell as many copies of your newspaper as possible, you are going to exaggerate and maybe just make stuff up. Muckrakers, on the other hand, the idea is that, alright, you're going to start raking the muck. You're going to start digging into stuff, investigating corruption, uncovering all these sorts of schemes. It's still pretty sensational, people still buy, but maybe you're also doing something good, along with selling copies of the newspaper. You have some of them, like an Ida Tarbell, she is really driven by her mission. If you're looking at one of the William Randolph Hearst-owned newspapers, he's driven by money. But if doing some investigative journalism leads to making more money, then there you go. So we sort of have a spread of motivations, but that's sort of the era of journalism we find ourselves in, and Theodore Roosevelt gives us the term muckrakers.
Indeed, political cartoons of the day cast Roosevelt as a crusading king, surrounded by knights representing prominent journalists and publications, with Ida Tarbell as Joan of Arc.
That's funny. You could definitely call what he did a bit of a crusade. Teddy was, a bit of a moral crusader, right? He would get up, use his bully pulpit, give these speeches full of moral indignation. He really sort of emphasized that part of what he was doing. And so, to call his sort of, regulatory effort a crusade against these big trusts might be a fair comparison. Not to the actual crusades, but just in terms of the sort of moral righteousness that word might evoke when used in a more general sense.
The speech also gave Americans a new term for these investigative, story-breaking journalists. Muckrakers.
Yep.
A label, for what it's worth, that Ida Tarbell hated. However,
it's not the nicest sounding term.
Not the only investigative journalist taking on corruption and big business.
No.
In the same issue where she began her series on Standard Oil, her McClure's colleague Ray Baker took on the use of intimidation and violence by labor unions against their own members. But it was Baker's investigation into a miner workers' strike in Colorado that first brought him Theodore Roosevelt's attention. There, corporations, crooked politicians, and banks had ostensibly squeezed the miners' union on the issue of working hours until they'd ignited a full-on revolt, with miners bombing company mine shafts and beating or assassinating new workers brought in to replace the strikers. The governor, a banker himself.
And this is how we get to that sort of violence. Think if you're one of those workers, right? You have a conspiracy, basically, between the business owners, the banks, and the politicians. How on earth are you going to make things better for yourself? You have no one to turn to. And when all avenues of legitimate progress have been blocked, what do people turn to? They turn to extremism. They turn to violence, right? And so, of course, you start up some kind of revolt, which is then violently intercepted by those very politicians. Not a great situation.
Self declared martial law and brought in the army. They arrested miners without warrants and threw them on deportation trains.
Wow.
One soldier threatened a judge with a bayonet outside of his own court.
Yikes.
Baker, eminently fair, charted how foul play on all sides had escalated the conflict and shared his article with...
Sure, foul play on all sides, but let's be honest, we know who holds the cards in this situation, right? There is a massive power imbalance. On one side, you've got the bankers, the politicians, and the business owners, and on the other side, you have the union. Yeah, I'm not saying everybody behaved fairly, sure, but the union is at a massive disadvantage.
with Roosevelt before publication. Roosevelt liked the piece so much, he wrote a statement endorsing the article.
Wow.
And that collaboration...
Now that's pretty unique. The president writing a statement endorsing your article. I mean, especially an article that's so politically charged, right? That is a unique moment.
Be their last. As the young president and crusading investigator found their interests aligning again the next year on the issue of railroads. Baker's next article examined how the railroad trusts, many partially owned by titans like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, used lawyers and corporate structures to skirt the new laws against rebates and still offer discounted rates to favored big businesses.
Yeah, and the railroads were Teddy's next big target. And you can really understand why. The railroads, we talk about all of these big corporations, these big industries, oil, steel. Railroads were one of them, right? They were immensely powerful. They held... Well, there's a couple of things about the railroads. First of all, railroads held a lot of land. People often don't think about this. They made a lot of money from selling or renting out land that they held. And ownership of land always has been, and even at this time, puts you in a very powerful position. In addition, of course, the railroads, they connect everything else. If you want to transport anything to anywhere, you need to use these railroads, which gives them a massive amount of power and a massive amount of leverage. You can see why all these big corporations like Standard Oil, U.S. Steel were sort of in bed with the railroads. They wanted good rates because they're such an important service. So when you start putting all of that together, you can start to see why the railroads were so important and so vital, not to mention something like passenger travel. Passenger travel has never been too profitable compared to, the commercial side of things, but it's absolutely key, especially at this point, if you want to go long distance. You could get in a boat, maybe hop in a horse, but at this point, you're going to get on a train. That is the way you get from one place to another. And so it's absolutely key to a lot of different facets of life, which is why, since railroads became so important, there's been a lot of government involvement, and there's been a lot of talk about, well, should the government take over? Should the government nationalize? There's a lot of questions because railroads are so key. But basically, I'm just sort of framing this so you can see how important and how powerful these railroads were.
Baker pointed out that this was particularly unfair, considering that the government had literally given the land to railroads in order for them to lay track.
Exactly. And so, first of all, given the land by the government, there's that. And then that touches on the land issue again. Railroads, they don't only just own the tracks, they own the land as well. And they do a lot of stuff with that land. So a lot of power there, and some of it just straight up granted by the government. In order to develop the country, to develop these railroads, these absolutely essential railroads. So it makes sense why the government would have a hand in this. But what they also inadvertently do is give these companies a lot of power.
If it was a public service, it should serve the public good.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, Roosevelt got early access to Baker's research, passing it on to the Interstate Commerce Commission and progressive lawmakers to begin crafting what would become the Hepburn Bill. Now, without getting too technical, the Hepburn Rate Act, named after the man who introduced it, would empower the ICC to regulate railroad shipping rates in the interest of leveling the playing field for businesses small and large. Going beyond rebates, the Hepburn Bill allowed the ICC to look at railroad companies' books and made it illegal to give out free passes to other companies' goods. And crucially for Rockefeller's business, it also covered pipelines. It passed the House of Representatives, where progressive Republicans were a major...
And that's a big expansion of power for the Interstate Commerce Commission. It's supposed to be, regulating interstate commerce, but that's sort of broad. It's can be unclear at times. All right, well, to what extent does the ICC have power to intervene? And so this is giving them a lot of power to interfere in the operations of these railroads, to set rates, to regulate that kind of thing. That is pretty remarkable. And this is where you get on that spectrum, right, of government intervention versus like free market. And you can specifically talk about railroads here, though of course this principle applies to, well, really any other market. There's always a spectrum of, do you have completely free market, no government intervention, or do you have complete government ownership? The railroads, right now, we're sort of sliding further down the spectrum. That gives the ICC more power, more government intervention, though of course, the railroads, there's always been a lot of government intervention because the government's helped set them up. And so for a lot of people, some of your more radical progressives at the time, in an American context, would argue that, well, maybe the government should own these railroads. And of course, in other countries, that is exactly what was happening. So there's a question of how far to go, right? How much regulation is needed? Are railroads so essential? Are they an essential public service? And so, should we just nationalize it to truly make it a public service? There's a lot of these things going around.
Force, without amendment, and barreled onto the Senate, where it hit a brick wall, because there was one group that did not want this to pass. The conservative wing of Roosevelt's own Republican Party, many of whom who had taken campaign contributions and personal free passes from the railroads. Chief among them was Republican leader Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was well known for killing progressive legislation that would impact big business. Having previously monkeyed with tariff rates to please the Sugar Trust, he also personally owned part of Rhode Island's trolley system until earlier that year he sold it to a railroad trust for an enormous profit. Aldrich and his conservatives attacked Roosevelt as a secret socialist, tying him to the furthest...
Just so funny, like Teddy Roosevelt as a socialist, anything but. My man was pro-regulation, but he was also pro-business. That is as clear as day. He was not anything close to a socialist. It's funny because you see some parallels between Teddy Roosevelt and his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, who we'll see in office a couple of decades from now. a man who was a capitalist, but felt that significant reform and regulation was needed in order to move the country forward, and then got accused of being a socialist and all that sort of stuff. But, of course, we've talked about the tension within the Republican Party. You have Teddy Roosevelt, he's on the reform progressive wing of the party. A good chunk of the party are still these more big business, corporate-style Republicans, conservatives. And a lot of them are either taking money from these trusts or, as we saw here, are involved themselves. So, of course, they're going to be frightened of Roosevelt and worried, oh no, what if it keeps going further and further? What's going to happen?
Left elements of the party who wanted to nationalize the railroads.
Oh, well, there you go.
But in addition to refusing to pass the bill, Aldrich decided to hobble it further by delegating leadership on it to a prominent Democrat.
Okay, who's this?
And the senator Roosevelt hated most, Pitchfork Ben Tillman. Now, it's really hard to understate what an odious figure Benjamin Tillman was.
Oh.
Called Pitchfork.
Yeah, Pitchfork, not a great nickname, I gotta say.
Ben, for his fiery speeches. Tillman rose to prominence during the fall of Reconstruction, when he led a paramilitary terrorist militia called the Red Shirts in a campaign of ballot box stuffing, voter intimidation, and murder against South Carolina's black community.
Yeah, so now we're getting into some post-Reconstruction Democratic politics. We've been talking a lot about the Republican Party so far, because they really held a lot of the power at this point. Following the Civil War, the Democrats had a hard time regaining power, though at this point, it's been decades, so the situation has changed. But immediately following the Civil War, you have Reconstruction under Ulysses S. Grant. We can skip over Andrew Johnson. And, during Reconstruction, we do see the emergence of a lot of these terrorist groups, like the KKK. But under Grant, he absolutely squashes the KKK in their first iteration. They will reemerge eventually, but he crushes them. After Grant is gone, we get Rutherford B. Hayes, and Reconstruction ends, which gives free rein to groups like the Red Shirts. First of all, look at that name. Think about what other shirts we have. We've got the brown shirts, Nazi Germany. We've got the black shirts, Mussolini. To be called the blank shirts, not a good sign. And it's an apt name. These red shirts, we're talking, post-Civil War, but a lot of these guys were involved with the Confederacy or were Confederate supporters, sort of lost cause mythology. And post-Reconstruction, the federal government would not step in to stop them. So we're talking about these white supremacist terrorist groups who would roam around the South, as they said, stuffing ballot boxes, intimidating black voters. That was a big part of it, is they wanted to stop black Americans from exercising their civil rights, whether that meant intimidating them at the polling place, trying to stop them from even coming, violence, murder, beatings, all of that sort of stuff. And, one of the sort of biggest symbols of this era is that hangman's noose is lynching, right? That was a big problem at this time. It'd be a big problem for decades. Because the federal government just really would not step in after Reconstruction was over. And so we see a lot of violence against the black communities in the South, a lot of intimidation, a lot of lynching, and that is what these sorts of paramilitary groups were doing, and there were a whole bunch of them that emerged. Like I said, the KKK would eventually reemerge again after Grant had crushed it the first time. So Senator Tillman here is associated with that. Yeah, not good at all. I'm unfamiliar with them, but already a bad start.
A vocal proponent of the idea that African Americans must either be subservient or exterminated. He was, for decades, the most open white supremacist in Congress.
Yeah, sounds like this guy was particularly radical, but also sounds like he represents that sort of post-Confederate Southern Democratic politician who, following Reconstruction, these guys were let back into Congress, and, they were just pro-Confederate in every way. A lot of them were pro-slavery, even if not openly. They were pro the subjugation of black people. They were pro this sort of racist violence. We're talking about some really sort of radically racist individuals.
And just for the record, in 1906, that's really saying something.
Yeah.
He and Roosevelt loathed each other. In 1901, Roosevelt invited African-American educator Booker T. Washington to formally and publicly dine with the Roosevelt family at the White House.
Yeah, if we're talking about sort of civil rights legislation, Teddy might not be the guy you necessarily turn to. But, and, of course, this is sort of a tricky era. It's pretty risky to be pro-civil rights, but Teddy takes a couple of steps, like inviting Booker T. Washington over, which is very controversial. A lot of people were very upset by that. But, so, Teddy did a couple of things like that on the issue of civil rights.
The first time a black man had done so.
Yeah.
Tillman's response to this act was so racist that I'm not even going to repeat it here. But I'll put it up here on the screen so you get an idea what kind of man this guy was.
Okay. I'm not going to read this, but yeah. So, Jesus. This is the kind of thing we see. The president dines with a black man, and the response is that we should kill 1,000 people in response, right? That is the level of sort of racist, radical, well, in some ways terrorism that we've been talking about with the red shirts and these other paramilitary groups. That is the response, right? They get upset by one thing, and their response is this immense sort of violence, or at least advocating for this immense sort of violence. Yeah,
their
true.
Relationship deteriorated
Not a good
further
guy.
the next year when Roosevelt withdrew Tillman's invitation to a White House dinner after he'd punched a fellow senator on the floor of Congress.
What?
And look,
Brother, what the hell? Violence on the floor of Congress, not the first time it's been seen. I mean, you can talk about slavery, we had a pre-Civil War caning. But, violence on the floor of Congress, discouraged. Not good. Always a bad sign.
we could go on all day about how awful Tillman is, but ultimately this is an episode about railroad trusts, and I'm pretty sure by
Right.
now you get how bad this guy
Now, let's
is.
get back on track.
But as much as Roosevelt hated Tillman, he was also a major opponent of the trusts. In fact, he was part of the Democratic bloc, attacking Roosevelt for not going after the trusts even harder. Despite their mutual distaste, Roosevelt reached out to Tillman, opening a channel of communication to negotiate on the finer points of the bill. Things didn't change between them. In fact, they never met in person, instead talking through a go-between. But they did work together as Tillman steered the bill through committee. Meanwhile, Roosevelt continued meeting with Ray Baker, getting his opinion on the legislation.
Maybe not a great guy to put in charge of the committee then. I know him and Roosevelt didn't like each other, and he was, a real piece of shit. But, if he is not opposed to this type of regulation, then it seems like he would probably be willing to work through it with Roosevelt. I mean, maybe the idea was, they hate each other so much that they could never work together. But it's like, if they have a common goal, then you imagine they could, and they did work together on that.
Baker, to put it mildly, wasn't happy. Because the Hepburn Bill was mostly concerned with regulating maximum shipping rates, ensuring railroads couldn't jack up prices on the smaller companies. But Baker argued the real problem was the minimum rates, because while raising rates got everyone's attention, it was the fact that the railroads played favorites by lowering rates for big companies that created unfair competition. He also showed Roosevelt how the railroads nickel and dimed smaller shippers by charging them more for elevator services, storage, refrigeration, and chronically underweighing shipments from favorite companies. In fact, at this point, Baker pushed Roosevelt so hard to go even further than he was that the president became annoyed with him. Sure, he knew his ideas were good, but he also knew they wouldn't pass Congress, especially in his Tillman alliance. But Roosevelt's attempt to reach across the aisle failed. Tillman couldn't rally enough Democratic support to pass the bill, even combined with the Senate's progressive Republicans. Their partnership fractured, their relationship even worse, and Roosevelt back at square one.
Okay, well.
If he wanted to do anything, Roosevelt realized he needed a middle way. Because on one hand, he had Democrats and progressive Republicans who wanted to nationalize railroads, a solution conservatives would not accept. And on the other, he had conservatives that wanted to do nothing. So he started fresh, reverting back to the original bill before it had been augmented with amendments suggested by Baker, Tillman, and pretty much everyone else. It was a simpler bill, one that did what Roosevelt wanted, but was much more moderate.
Okay.
It passed. Sure, it was full of loopholes and extraneous amendments, and would...
That's every piece of legislation in this country. I mean, sorry, not to be too cynical, but let's be honest. Every single act that we pass is full of loopholes and amendments and, just a bunch of useless stuff that shouldn't have been included. So, that's every act we pass.
would need to be strengthened in 1910. But Roosevelt had done what was previously thought impossible, to restrain a trust not just with the courts, but with preemptive legislation. Even Tillman set aside his qualms and voted for it. And that was good, because even as Roosevelt celebrated his latest victory against the trusts, a new book had come out detailing shocking abuse, danger, and monopoly in another American industry, the slaughterhouses of Chicago.
Okay.
Meaning Roosevelt's next task was to take a cleaver to the meat trust.
Interesting.
And while
Kind of didn't expect we'd go in that direction. The whole clean food and et cetera, et cetera. I won't get into it now. It's like, it's linked, but it's also sort of one of Theodore Roosevelt's other things that he did. I mean, we're only talking about sort of the trust busting and regulation. Teddy Roosevelt did a lot. I mean, there's the environmentalism. We could talk about that. And there's also the clean food. But I guess that is sort of tangentially related to or not even tangentially, it is related to the rest of this, the other antitrust action, I suppose, or the other regulatory action, right? That's interesting stuff to cover. I mean, hey, it'd be fun to cover the entirety of Teddy's presidential term. Maybe we'll do some videos on that. Okay, so another interesting episode. This one was far more focused on the legislation, the issue with the railroads, the Hepburn Act. We had a little aside about muckrakers and post-Reconstruction South and, some other stuff, but this was mainly focused on passing the Hepburn Act, which, like I said, did give the ICC more power to regulate these types of things. Have more power over the industry, over the railroads, which is, that was exactly what they were going for. So, an interesting episode. We've got one more left in the series. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe. Anyway, all of that out of the way, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.